Hello everyone. Let's resume our account of the People's Republic of China, that is, the republic founded after the Communist Revolution of 1949. In the first episode of this series, after briefly introducing China and its symbols, we began with the inauguration ceremony on October the 1st, 1949, when Mao Zedong announced to the world that the Chinese people have risen up. We then went back about 100 years to see the situation from which they had risen up. We also recounted the Opium War and the beginning of the so called century of national humiliation, which began to change course according to party historiography with the May 4th movement of 1919 and, most importantly, the founding of the Communist Party itself in 1921. In this second episode, we return to October the 1st, 1949, but this time we move forward to the following day to see what challenges China was facing. We will mention the Civil War just won against the Kuomintang, the friendship with communist USSR, and the indisputable leadership of Chairman Mao Zedong. Then we will look into the new Chinese society to see the new role that the revolution attributed to women, children, peasants, and the anti revolutionaries too. In other words, we'll see how the Communist Party tried to establish a new China. With the revolution completed, there were still some major challenges to be solved, the first of which is represented in this poster: destroy the Kuomintang and all the other counter revolutionary organizations. The Kuomintang is the Nationalist Party against which the communists had fought a civil war lasting more than 20 years, starting after the death of Sun Yat-sen, whom we mentioned in the first video, the first president of the Republic of China, the First Republic of China of 1912. Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, and the civil war continued from shortly thereafter until practically 1949, until Mao's speech in Tiananmen Square, with just a couple of interruptions, the so-called United Fronts of 1924 to 27 and 1937 to 43, two brief periods in which communists and nationalists stopped shooting at each other to address some more pressing problems that China was facing. For example, the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, which we also mentioned last time. Once the Japanese Empire had been dismembered and the puppet state of Manchukuo dissolved with the end of World War II in 1945, communists and nationalists resumed their civil war, which would end with the communist victory in 1949 and the retreat of the nationalists to the island of Taiwan, which in the meantime had been abandoned by Japan itself, its former occupant since the Sino Japanese War of 1895. This poster calls for the need to complete the task of the revolution by hunting down the last counter revolutionary nationalists still in China, who might try to sabotage the revolution from within. A second open question for New China is in this poster. The union between China and Russia is unbeatable. Strengthen the fraternal Sino Soviet alliance. Communist Russia, the leading country of the USSR, that is, of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, is currently seen as a model and a kind of older brother by the Chinese communists of the newly formed People's Republic, and one of its few international friends, to say the truth. This vision, born out of the ideological closeness between the two countries, will last only another couple of years, that is, until the death of Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, in 1953, after which this fraternal relationship will change a little bit, because at that point the Soviets, led by the new secretary Nikita Khrushchev, will be accused by the Chinese of being revisionists, that is, of having revised, modified, or rather betrayed their own ideological foundations, which is the worst accusation that can be thrown against the revolutionaries, of course. And China will enter into some way of opposition and competition with the Soviet Union to demonstrate the greater effectiveness of its own path to communism. More on this in the fourth episode. A third central concept in New China is found in this poster: New China under the wise leadership of Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao Zedong is the undisputed leader of New China. He is one of the founders of the Communist Party. He is the heroic leader of the Long March, the courageous epic in which the communists between 1934 and 35 traveled 12,000 kilometers on foot while being pursued by the Kuomintang nationalists. We see here, albeit in very small size, sorry, the route that takes them back to the north from the south. The nationalists at the time had the upper hand and were aiming to eliminate their opponents, but the communists, who along the way lost exhausted men but recruited others, managed to re establish themselves at their new base in Yan'an, where you see the march end, and from there to counterattack, managing to win the war 15 years later. We see here depicted alongside the great Elmsman, the title by which Mao became famous in China and around the world, workers, peasants, and soldiers. That is, the three social groups ideologically at the foundation of the revolution. We see the army tanks in the foreground defending the nation, the enthusiasm of the political demonstration. We see the workers and the peasants hard at work building and feeding the new China. We see the schools where the masses are educated in the new ideology, where the new society is being shaped. The artists producing the propaganda posters of this first phase were either anti-Japanese artists in the occupied areas or artists returning to China after fleeing abroad following the invasion and the violence of the civil war. And they returned full of patriotic hopes to celebrate the birth of the new China and its bright future. These are the artists whom Mao, in the fundamental speeches on the role of culture and art, held at the communist base in Yan'an at the end of the Long March, had urged to stand against the aggressor, exploiters, and oppressors, and alongside the revolutionary masses. These are the artists we see represented in this poster. Long live the triumph of Chairman Mao's revolutionary line of literature and art. Unfortunately, I have not been able to date this poster, and it is certainly a later one, but it captures the concept. The artists were given by Mao the task of educating the population in revolutionary ideals, of warming their hearts so that they could devote themselves entirely to the cause and build a new China. Once China has been made, we could say we need to make the Chinese. We need to build this new China, but how? The first poster tells us buy a calf and productivity will increase. New China starts with the peasants. We saw them a while ago with workers and soldiers represented at the base of the revolution. But the peasants are somehow at the center of the base, and this is a fundamental characteristic of Chinese communism that differentiates it ideologically from Soviet communism. The latter is in fact based on urban factories and therefore on workers, while Chinese communism, at least in theory, is based on agricultural fields and therefore on peasants. This choice is probably due to really ancient reasons. The primary concern of the Chinese has been for centuries, perhaps for millennia, food, and will unfortunately continue to be so for at least a few more decades. Indeed, the Chinese have always been very numerous, and food has rarely been enough for everyone to eat. So much so that even today, a way of greeting each other in China, at least among people of a certain age who have lived through the final years of this millennia of scarcity, is this one, Chifalema, meaning have you eaten? But control of the countryside was also crucial for another historical, even mythological reason, the need to control the course of the rivers. Here we see a map of the main ones, and we see them concentrated in the fertile central eastern plain, the cradle where Chinese civilization was born and has grown, and where the majority of the population still lives and thrives today. For millennia, the stability or collapse of dynasties was justified by the confirmation or revocation of the so called mandate of heaven, Tianming in Chinese, the mandate that heaven conferred on the emperor as a just and virtuous man, and revoked if he proved instead to be incompetent or corrupt. And how could one tell whether a ruler belonged to one category or the other? Well, natural disasters such as frequent famines, but even more frequently floods, and the deadly overflowing of the many powerful rivers of the Chinese plain, which each time resulted in thousands or tens of thousands of deaths, certifying the loss of the mandate and thus justified a possible rebellion by an army of rebels who, after seizing power, would boast the title of dynasty. That's why the character Fa that I wrote here and means law represents three drops of water, which I colored here in red, and the verb to go in blue. Being able to control where the water goes is precisely what the law does, what those tasked with ruling must do. And if they fail to do so, it means it's time for a revolution. Even today, the Chinese word we translate as revolution, "goming," does not carry with itself the connotation of a subversion or change of direction of the Latin word, but actually means revocation of the mandate. Second poster, strive for a strong and efficient transportation system. Here, however, is a common trait between Chinese and Soviet communism. Heavy industry is seen as a driver of growth. China also copied the idea of 5 year plans from the USSR to centrally plan its economy, and we'll come back to this point in the next video. This poster tells us that an efficient transportation system is a symbol of modernity, of wealth that is produced and easily shared throughout the country. But it will also be in the years of reform and opening up, which we'll see in an upcoming video, the network through which internal migration will run. This migration bringing especially young people from the rural hinterland to the coastal cities will cause the urban population to grow from around 130 million people, less than 20% of the total in 1960, to nearly 600 million, over 40% in 2005, and up to nearly 900 million, two-thirds of the total today. The most obvious and spectacular result of the policy promoted by this poster is certainly the construction of the Wuhan Bridge, inaugurated in 1957. The first bridge on the 10,000 li long Yangzi River, as this poster puts it. 1 li corresponds to half a kilometer, and therefore the Yangtze River is actually even longer than 10,000 li or 5,000 kilometers, given that it flows for 6,300 kilometers from Tibet to its mouth near Shanghai. The bridge represents a double-decker engineering marvel for road and rail transportation, capable of joining the two banks of the river, about a kilometer and a half apart at that point, and above all, thus uniting the north and south of the country, because in fact, until then, there had been no stable crossing between Yibin in Sichuan, which is more or less where I put the red X, and Shanghai on the coast, meaning there was no bridge for about 2,000 kilometers, and goods traveling between north and south had to be loaded on two barges and transported from one bank of the great river to the other. This had been the case for thousands of years before the first bridge on the Yangtze River, which would actually be the first of a long series. Today, in fact, there are more than 70 bridges on the same stretch, from Yibin to Shanghai, and 9 in the city of Wuhan alone, which is circled in the center of the map. A quick aside for a new bibliographical recommendation: the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, with its difficult barge crossings and dangerous swamplands, are the setting for one of the four classic Chinese novels, The Water Margin by Shenayan and Luo Guanzhong. It is a 15th century novel, also translated into English as The Outlaws of the Marsh. It tells the adventures of a band of disinherited people who lived in one of the dangerous swamps of the plain. But let's return to the building of New China. Third poster, the women of New China. Women in the new China are emancipated, at least more so than they were in the past. In fact, Chairman Mao went so far as to say that they hold up half of the sky. Communist China put an end, among other things, to an ancient custom, foot binding, a true mutilation of women's feet motivated by absurd aesthetic criteria, the idea that small is beautiful. The tight binding, which impeded the natural growth of the feet, rendered women thus mutilated incapable of walking without aids, certainly unfit for many jobs, and totally dependent on others for their mobility. In contrast to this tradition, the poster shows women working in factories, in the fields, at the market, at home, and also obviously in the People's Liberation Army, defending the homeland. The story of an all female regiment, the Women's Red Detachment, was performed in theaters across the country in the 1960s as one of the 8 model revolutionary plays. We'll discuss it again in the fifth video when we discuss the Cultural Revolution. Returning to women's emancipation in the People's Republic, it's not easy to make an objective judgment on the freedom and political power Chinese women actually achieved after the revolution. Certainly, we can't ignore the limitations imposed by the one child policy, the law that between 1979 and 2013 made it a crime to give birth to a second child, and its tragic consequences for many baby girls who were aborted back then, nor the fact that no woman has ever held the top positions in the party or the republic, and that only 6 women have ever been members of the Politburo in the party's now century long history. But on the other hand, it's worth remembering here that many of the Western civilized countries never had a woman as a president or prime minister. I'm thinking about Spain or the US, and my country, Italy, had one only in 2022. And it's also worth remembering that abortion, which was legalized only in the 70s in Italy, Germany, France, and the US, had been legal in China since 1953. In short, when we try to take an interest in something new and different from ourselves and try to understand it, it's always useful to keep in mind that the answer can rarely be so simple. This is good, this is bad. Let's move on. Fourth poster, The Children of the New China. The children are depicted here in a not so original way as our own future, and they are enthusiastically playing. What kind of game? Well, they are not in school, obviously. Their education is pure indoctrination, as it is typical of totalitarian regimes. Let's take a closer look at the game they're playing. One works in a factory producing bullets, another one, a female, is driving a tank, well, at least in this, gender equality is evident, while behind her is an abundance of wheat. The other 3, farther to the right, are playing war, impersonating a soldier, a sailor, and an aviator attacking what's across the strait, namely the island of Taiwan, where the nationalists had taken refuge, remember? We'll get back to that in a moment. The island is defended by US soldiers, depicted as close to surrender as they succumb to the blows of these children. The underlying message of the poster is maybe not this one generation, but certainly the next one will see a powerful and reunified China on both sides of the strait. To build a new China, everyone is needed. In the first video, we mentioned the existence of 55 ethnic minorities in the country, in addition to the Han majority. These 55 minorities actually number more than 100 million people, as they are recognized and they are recognized by the constitution as different groups that together form part of the larger Chinese ethnic group. This poster celebrates this diversity and, in fact, says, Long live the great unity of all the peoples of the whole nation. The great internal ethnic diversity is the result, among other things, of the geographical expansion that took place during the Qing era, the dynasty that reigned between 1644 and 1911, a dynasty of Manchurian, therefore not Han, ethnicity that, starting from northeastern China, which you see here in pink, conquered historical China ruled by the previous dynasty, the Ming, which here is in yellow, and expanded towards Central Asia, as you see here in green, incorporating present day Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet, and all their populations, of course, as well as the island of Taiwan, there in the bottom right. The orange colored states are those who were regularly sending their tributes to the Qing, even if they were not formally part of the empire, but were the neighbors that China, as we said in the first video, considered dwarfs, who rather than trading with the empire, sent it tribute and gifts. The various groups differ from each other based on traditions, cultures, religions, and even languages. The Chinese language, or Mandarin Chinese, we speak of, is in fact only one of the existing local varieties, and the 7 linguistic varieties of Chinese, or the Chinese language family you see located here on the map, although written with the same characters, can be orally as different and unintelligible to each other as Italian, French, Spanish, and Romanian are, or even more so. Then there are ethnic minorities who speak languages completely different from Mandarin Chinese and use their own writing system. Here's a sample of six of them. Some of these writing systems developed precisely following the birth of the People's Republic. In an article of a few years ago, the People's Daily counted 27 of these new writing systems, obviously in a way that celebrated the party's role in recognizing and developing minority identities. But let's go back to the poster. Long live the great unity of all the people of the whole nation, which celebrates the diversity of ethnic minorities as the country's wealth. All the peoples of China, together and under the leadership of the Communist Party, can peacefully create the new society. This idea is embodied in various policies promoted by the party in recent years, from minority quotas for university admissions and public office to exemptions from the one child policy, which will be abolished in 2013 for minority couples, to the creation of administrative bodies at various levels entrusted to specific minorities that are nevertheless the majority in that particular area, such as the five autonomous regions of Guangxi, Inner Mongolia, Ningxia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. However, the fact that even in these regions economic power, if not in fact political power, is usually held by the Han majority of Chinese, combined with the massive immigration of Han people that somehow changes the numbers and makes ethnic minorities a minority, even in what were historically their own areas, gives rise to more or less heated social conflicts, such as those in Tibet or Xinjiang, which we talk about every other decade, let's say, following large demonstrations such as those for Tibetan independence in 2008 during the Beijing Olympics, or riots like the one in Xinjiang, which the Chinese government calls terrorist attacks, and which led to the imprisonment of thousands or of dissidents, perhaps as many as a million of dissidents in the province, and which we talk about, I was saying, on and off, usually when our companies are not in the People's Republic negotiating important economic agreements. Okay, we were saying building the new China. This poster says save our Taiwanese compatriots and refers to another important issue that remained open after the revolution. In 1949, as we said, the communists won the civil war against the Kuomintang nationalists and took control of mainland China. But the defeated nationalists crossed the 150-kilometer wide Taiwan Strait and took refuge on the island, which had just been liberated from the Japanese occupation that began in 1895 with the Sino-Japanese War we mentioned in the previous video, and ended with Japan's defeat in World War II. The nationalists fled to Taiwan and take with them all the gold, silver, and dollar reserves they managed to steal from the government's coffers, and there they remain and stay so to this day. Thus, this poster depicts the Chinese of Taiwan as victims, as hostages of these nationalists. The tension that arose in 1949 when the nationalists crossed the strait reached its peak the following year when the United States Seventh Fleet, in the midst of the Cold War, positioned itself in the middle of the strait to defend the nationalists. This prevented the communists from reaching the island and completing the revolution by annexing the last province of historic China, that of the Qing Empire at its greatest extent, namely Taiwan. In Taiwan, the Nationalist Party transferred the provisional government of Chiang Kai shek, who enforced martial law and thus granted very limited freedom to his people for nearly 40 years until 1987, before allowing elections in the 1990s and then losing them for the first time in the year 2000. The situation in Taiwan will then remain open, and it remains open today as I speak to you in 2025, so much so that what China considers its own province is actually recognized by most governments around the world as an independent nation. This other poster, however, refers to another last issue. Do your utmost to help the government get rid of hidden counter-revolutionaries. Here we're talking about internal political adversaries, those who remained in China. We're talking about counter revolutionaries. We're talking about the bourgeoisie. We're talking about right wing elements. There is the people who remained in China but disagreed with the revolution and who somehow tried, or at least so the party believes, and so this poster maintains, They tried to sabotage it from within. And internal sabotage was something China could not afford at all, given that it was mostly isolated on the international level in this period, as we shall see in the next episode. Various political campaigns were launched against these people, against these groups, one of the most famous being the one that began in 1957 with the so called 100 Flowers campaign. President Mao had said, let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought compete, inviting young people and intellectuals to express their opinions on the changes China had undertaken and the measures to be adopted in the future. It was or appeared to be an opening aimed at encouraging debate and improving the system that is China's communism through constructive criticism. However, the criticism quickly escalated, involving even fundamental aspects of the political system, and surprised the party and Mao himself. Thus, when the criticism became too much, what some had seen as a democratic opening transformed into the campaign against the rightists, as seen in this poster. Smash the rightists' furious attacks, defend socialist construction. Those who had made overly profound criticisms were thus accused of being counter revolutionaries, attempting to sabotage the revolution from within. It is estimated that 500,000 people were persecuted during the 2 year campaign. I don't have a specific book recommendation for this period, but a section of Yu Hua's novel To Live, which was also adapted into a film by Zhang Yimou in 1994, is set during these years and may help us understand them better. We'll stop here for today. There is still a long way to go. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to this channel so you'll be first to know when the new one is out. And if you loved it, buy me a coffee through the link down here. In the next episode, we'll discuss how the new China we introduced today positioned itself internationally during the Cold War. We'll discuss the Korean War, China, anti Americanism, and the non aligned countries. Until then, 再见.